In just a few days, billions of dollars disappeared. Entire companies ceased to exist. Banks collapsed. And millions of people lost everything they had. But the most frightening part is that no one imagined this could happen. The United States, late 1920s, the richest country in the world, the largest economy on the planet, a symbol of progress, innovation, and success. It was a so-called Jazz Age, a period marked by accelerated growth, mass consumption, and almost blind confidence in the future. Cars were being produced on a scale never seen before. Radios were entering homes. Appliances were beginning to transform everyday life. Industry was growing. Credit was expanding. And the American lifestyle was starting to influence the entire world. For the first time in history, millions of people could buy things that were once considered luxury: refrigerators, automobiles, washing machines, and not only with their own money, but with credit. The installment buying system spread rapidly. Buy now, pay later. That was the new motto, and it created a sense of wealth, even when the money did not yet exist. But the real center of this euphoria was not in the factories. It was on Wall Street, the New York Stock Exchange. There, it seemed that money simply multiplied. Stocks kept rising constantly. Companies increased in value without stopping. And investing in the stock market became something common, very common. Not just bankers, but teachers, drivers, secretaries, small business owners. Everyone wanted to be part of it because everyone believed the same thing, that prices would only go up. But there was a problem. This growth was not sustainable. A large part of the rise in stock prices did not reflect the real performance of companies. It was speculation. People were buying stocks, not because they believed in the companies, but because they believed someone else would pay more later. This created a dangerous cycle, a cycle based on expectation, not reality. And the situation became even more risky because many investors were not using their own money. They were buying stocks with borrowed money, known as buying on margin. It worked like this. You put in a small amount and borrowed the rest, betting that future profits would cover the debt. As long as prices were rising, everything seemed to work. But when prices fell, the system collapsed. And the most impressive part is that the warning signs were already there. Industrial production was beginning to slow down. Wages were not growing at the same pace. Inequality was increasing, and many sectors of the economy were already struggling. But no one wanted to see it, because confidence was stronger than reality. It was a kind of collective blindness, a belief that growth was eternal. The American economy at that moment was like a house of cards. It depended on three things: confidence, credit, and speculation. And when a system depends on that, it does not take much to bring it down. Just a doubt, a fear, a wrong move. And that is exactly what began to happen. At the end of 1929, some investors started to sell. Small movements, almost imperceptible, but enough to create uncertainty. And in the financial market, uncertainty is the beginning of the end. Then came the moment, October 1929, days that would enter history, days when fear replaced confidence. And when that happened, the entire system began to collapse. But what exactly happened during those days? How did a market that only went up collapse so quickly? And why was no one able to stop it? In just a few days, billions of dollars disappeared. Entire companies ceased to exist. Banks collapsed. And millions of people lost everything they had. But the most frightening part is that no one imagined this could happen. The United States, late 1920s, the richest country in the world, the largest economy on the planet, a symbol of progress, innovation, and success. It was a so-called Jazz Age, a period marked by accelerated growth, mass consumption, and almost blind confidence in the future. Cars were being produced on a scale never seen before. Radios were entering homes. Appliances were beginning to transform everyday life. Industry was growing. Credit was expanding. And the American lifestyle was starting to influence the entire world. For the first time in history, millions of people could buy things that were once considered luxury: refrigerators, automobiles, washing machines, and not only with their own money, but with credit. The installment buying system spread rapidly. Buy now, pay later. That was the new motto, and it created a sense of wealth, even when the money did not yet exist. But the real center of this euphoria was not in the factories. It was on Wall Street, the New York Stock Exchange. There, it seemed that money simply multiplied. Stocks kept rising constantly. Companies increased in value without stopping, and investing in the stock market became something common, very common. Not just bankers, but teachers, drivers, secretaries, small business owners. Everyone wanted to be part of it because everyone believed the same thing, that prices would only go up. But there was a problem. This growth was not sustainable. A large part of the rise in stock prices did not reflect the real performance of companies. It was speculation. People were buying stocks, not because they believed in the companies, but because they believed someone else would pay more later. This created a dangerous cycle. A cycle based on expectation, not reality. And the situation became even more risky because many investors were not using their own money. They were buying stocks with borrowed money, known as buying on margin. It worked like this. You put in a small amount and borrowed the rest, betting that future profits would cover the debt. As long as prices were rising, everything seemed to work. But when prices fell, the system collapsed. And the most impressive part is that the warning signs were already there. Industrial production was beginning to slow down. Wages were not growing at the same pace. Inequality was increasing, and many sectors of the economy were already struggling, but no one wanted to see it because confidence was stronger than reality. It was a kind of collective blindness, a belief that growth was eternal. The American economy at that moment was like a house of cards. It depended on three things: confidence, credit, and speculation. And when a system depends on that, it does not take much to bring it down. Just a doubt, a fear, a wrong move. And that is exactly what began to happen. At the end of 1929, some investors started to sell. Small movements, almost imperceptible, but enough to create uncertainty. And in the financial market, uncertainty is the beginning of the end. Then came the moment, October 1929, days that would enter history, days when fear replaced confidence. And when that happened, the entire system began to collapse. But what exactly happened during those days? How did a market that only went up collapse so quickly? And why was no one able to stop it? After the stock market crash, many believed that the worst was already over. But in reality, the real disaster was only just beginning, because the problem was not only the stock market, it was the entire system. During the years of growth, banks had taken enormous risks. They lent money to investors. They financed companies. They supported consumption. And they operated with an extremely fragile model. They did not keep all of the customers' money. They lent a large part of it. This works as long as people trust the system. But when confidence disappears, the system breaks. With the fall of the stock market, fear began to spread. People began to doubt. What if the bank fails? What if my money disappears? And then they did what anyone would do. They went to withdraw their money. Lines began to form. Long, silent, tense. People waiting to withdraw their savings. Not out of immediate necessity, but out of fear. And that fear spread rapidly. Because when someone sees a line at a bank, they think, I need to take my money out too. And here is the central problem. Banks did not have money for everyone. They only had a part. The rest was lent, invested, in circulation. So when many people tried to withdraw at the same time, the bank simply could not pay. And when a bank cannot pay, it fails. And that is exactly what happened. First one bank, then another, then dozens, then hundreds. Thousands of banks closed their doors, without warning, without solution, without return. And the most devastating part is that there was no protection. There was no deposit insurance. If the bank failed, the money disappeared. Just like that. A lifetime of savings, gone. Entire families lost everything. This was not just an economic crisis. It was a crisis of confidence, a psychological crisis. People began to realize something terrifying. The system was not safe. Money was not guaranteed. The future was not stable. And when that happens, the entire society changes. With banks failing, credit disappeared. Companies could no longer get loans. People could no longer buy. Investment stopped. Consumption fell. And the economy began to slow down rapidly. Without credit, without consumption, without investment, companies began to suffer. Production fell. Profits disappeared. And then came the most difficult decision: to cut costs, to fire people. Unemployment began slowly, almost imperceptibly, but quickly it became an avalanche. Thousands, then millions. People lost their jobs, without warning, without protection, without alternatives. And once again, this did not remain only in the United States. European banks also depended on the American system. Entire economies were connected. And when credit disappears at the center of the world, the impact spreads. Now, the problem was no longer the stock market. It was not just investors. It was the entire society. Workers, families, companies, entire cities. Everyone was beginning to feel the weight of the crisis. And the worst was yet to come, because the collapse of the banks was only the beginning of something much bigger. A social crisis, a human crisis, a crisis that would place millions of people face to face with hunger. But what was it like to live during this crisis? What happened to ordinary people? What was daily life like? Without money, without work, and without hope? With banks failing and credit disappearing, companies began to collapse. Without loans, without investments, and with falling consumption, the productive system began to stall. Factories reduced their pace. Machines stopped. Production lines were left empty. Products were no longer being manufactured. And the reason was simple. There was no one to buy. People were afraid, without money, and without confidence in the future. And this created a devastating cycle. Less consumption led to less production. Less production led to layoffs. More unemployment led to even less consumption. And the cycle continued, getting worse each time. Companies began to cut costs. First, they reduced wages. Then, they reduced working hours. And then, the layoffs began. At first, it seemed temporary, but quickly it became permanent. In just a few months, the number of unemployed skyrocketed. Millions of people lost their jobs. Men who supported families, industrial workers, merchants, employees, professionals from all areas. And the impact was immediate. Without income, bills could not be paid. rent, food, clothing. Everything began to disappear. Entire families fell into despair. Many people lost their homes. They could not pay mortgages. They could not pay rent. And they were evicted without alternatives, without protection, without help. And then new scenes began to appear. Improvised camps, shacks made of wood, cardboard, scrap. These places became known as Hoovervilles, a reference to President Herbert Hoover. And for many, it was all that remained. Hunger began to spread. Food lines became common. Long lines, silent, people waiting for a bowl of soup, for a piece of bread. Charities tried to help, but it was not enough. For many, the worst part was not just hunger, it was humiliation. Men who once worked, now depended on help. Fathers who once supported their families, now could not feed their children. The crisis did not only destroy the economy, it destroyed dignity. Despair increased, anxiety grew, uncertainty dominated, and many people began to lose hope because it was not just lack of money, it was lack of perspective. The United States, the richest country in the world, was now facing a completely different reality. Mass unemployment, hunger, inequality, instability, and a growing feeling that no one was in control. The crisis was no longer just economic. It was social. It was human. It was structural. And the government still had no answer. And this raised a dangerous question. If the system cannot protect people, then what is it for? But how did the government respond to all of this? Why did the first responses fail? And who was the man responsible for trying to control this crisis? When the crisis began, the United States had a president. His name was Herbert Hoover, and at first, many believed he was the right man for that moment. Hoover was not a common politician. He was an engineer, a businessman, and he had a reputation for being efficient. He had stood out in humanitarian operations during the First World War. He was seen as someone competent, organized, rational, but there was a problem. He deeply believed in one idea, that the government should not directly interfere in the economy. For Hoover, the market should adjust itself. The economy would go through a difficult phase, but would eventually recover, without heavy state intervention. This view was common at the time, based on classical economic liberalism. Less government, more economic freedom, more autonomy for businesses. The problem is that the crisis of 1929 was not a normal crisis. It was not temporary. It was not localized. It was systemic, deep, global, and it required fast responses. But that did not happen. Hoover tried to act, but in a limited way. He encouraged companies not to fire employees. He asked banks to cooperate. He tried to maintain confidence in the system. But these measures were voluntary. They were not mandatory. And in a crisis of that scale, that was not enough. Companies continued to lay off workers. Banks continued to fail. Unemployment continued to rise. The economy continued to fall. And the population began to realize something dangerous. The government was not in control. In 1930, Hoover approved one of the most controversial measures of the crisis, the Smoot-Hawley tariff. It increased taxes on imported goods. The idea was to protect American companies, but the effect was the opposite. Other countries reacted, created their own tariffs, and international trade collapsed. The world began to close its economies. Less exports, less imports, less circulation of money. The crisis, which was already severe, became even worse. Meanwhile, people's lives continued to deteriorate. Unemployment, hunger, desperation, and no concrete solution. Frustration began to grow, and Hoover's name became associated with the crisis. The camps of homeless people began to be called Hoovervilles, a form of protest, a form of blame, a way of saying, this is the government's responsibility. The crisis stopped being only economic. Now it was political. People began to question, what is the government for? Who is in control? Is there a solution? And then the situation reached a new level. Veterans of the First World War, unemployed, without money, made a decision. They would march to Washington. And what happened next would become one of the most tense moments in the history of the United States. A direct confrontation between the government and the people themselves. But what was the bonus army? Why did thousands of people decide to protest? And how did the government respond? In the middle of the crisis, there was a group that believed they had a right to something. Veterans of the First World War, men who had fought for the country, who had risked their lives, and who, years later, found themselves without jobs, without money, and without support. After the war, the American government had promised a financial bonus to these veterans, a kind of compensation. But there was an important detail. This payment would only be made years later, in 1945. But in 1932, these men could not wait. They were starving, and so they made a decision. They would march to Washington to demand immediate payment. Thousands of veterans, along with their families, traveled from different parts of the country, without money, without structure, driven only by necessity. When they arrived in Washington, they did something unexpected. They set up camps, improvised shacks, tents, simple shelters, and began to occupy the city. This group would become known as the Bonus Army. Imagine the scene. Men who had fought in war, now living in shacks. Entire families camped in the capital of the country, asking for help, asking for dignity, asking for what they believed was fair. Their presence created tension, increased pressure on the government, and placed Hoover in an extremely delicate situation. Congress even discussed early payment, but the proposal was rejected. The veterans decided to stay. They would not leave. They had nowhere to go, and they would not accept leaving without an answer. The situation began to grow more tense, more political, more dangerous. And then the government made a decision that would deeply mark the history of the United States. Hoover ordered that the camps be removed. By force, the army was mobilized. Armed soldiers, cavalry, tanks, yes, tanks, against citizens, against veterans. The confrontation was violent. Shacks were destroyed. People were expelled. Families ran. Men who had fought for the country were now being attacked by it. The images shocked the nation. Public opinion changed, and confidence in the government fell even further, because now it was no longer just an economic crisis. It was a moral crisis. That moment marked the political end of Herbert Hoover. The population completely lost trust, and it became clear that the country needed something different, a new leadership, a new approach, and that change was about to happen. A new name was beginning to emerge, a new plan, a new promise. But who was this new leader? And how did he intend to save an economy in collapse? In 1932, the United States was in collapse. Mass unemployment, hunger, banks failing, companies closing, and a population that no longer believed in the government. It was in this scenario that an election would change everything. His name was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, known as FDR. Unlike Hoover, Roosevelt did not believe that the market would fix itself. He believed in action, intervention, and immediate change. Roosevelt understood something fundamental. The crisis was not only economic, it was social, it was human, and it required a strong response, direct and fast. But Roosevelt did not bring only policies. He brought something equally important, confidence, through radio speeches, known as fireside chats. He spoke directly to the population in a simple way, clear, human. For the first time, many Americans felt that someone was in control. When he took office in 1933, the situation was critical. The banking system was on the verge of total collapse. So Roosevelt made an immediate decision to close all the banks, all of them. For a few days, no bank operated. The objective was clear: to stop the panic, to reorganize the system, to restore confidence. During this period, the government analyzed the banks, separated the healthy from the failed ones, and only allowed the trustworthy ones to reopen. When the banks reopened, something surprising happened. People began to deposit money again. Confidence was returning. But this was only the beginning. Roosevelt launched a massive set of measures, known as the New Deal, a new agreement between the government and society. The plan had three main objectives: relief, to help those who were suffering; recovery, to reactivate the economy; reform, to prevent new crises. The government began to create jobs directly: construction of roads, bridges, dams, infrastructure. Millions of people went back to work. Projects like the Tennessee Valley Authority transformed entire regions. They brought electricity, development, and new opportunities. The government also began to regulate the financial system. It created the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, to supervise the stock market and prevent abuses. The FDIC was created, a system to guarantee deposits. Now, if a bank failed, people's money would be protected. This represented a profound change. The government now had an active role in the economy, something that had previously been rejected, but now it was necessary. Of course, not everyone supported the New Deal. Some said that the government was going too far, that it was interfering too much. But for millions of people, it was the only hope. The economy began to show signs of improvement. Slow, gradual, but real. And for the first time since 1929, there was something different in the air. But did the New Deal really work? Did it solve the crisis? Or did it only delay something bigger? And more importantly, what really pulled the world out of the Great Depression? The New Deal brought changes. It created jobs. It restored part of the confidence. It reorganized the financial system. But the question that remains is, did it really solve the crisis? The economy began to improve, but not quickly. The growth was slow, gradual, and full of uncertainty. Unemployment was still high. Millions of people were still without work. Poverty was still a reality. This raised doubts. The New Deal did not solve the crisis immediately, but it did something fundamental. It prevented an even greater collapse. It stabilized the system. It created a foundation, and it gave the economy time to breathe. One of the greatest achievements of the New Deal was the reform of the financial system. Now there were rules, supervision, protection. The market was no longer completely free, and this reduced risks. Millions of people went back to work, even if temporarily, even if with low wages. But this brought something important: dignity, stability, hope. But not everyone agreed. There were criticisms from all sides. Business leaders said the government was interfering too much, creating dependency, limiting economic freedom. Others said the opposite, that the New Deal was not enough, that deeper changes were necessary, that the system needed to be completely transformed. The truth is that the New Deal was a middle ground. It was not a revolution, but it was not continuity either. It was an adaptation. And then, in 1937, something unexpected happened. The economy fell again. A new recession. This showed something important. The recovery was still not solid. The crisis was still not over. The New Deal helped, but it was not enough to completely end the Great Depression. And this raises one of the most important questions in economic history. What really pulled the world out of crisis? Because the answer is not only in the economy, it is in something much bigger, something that would change the world forever. A new conflict was emerging, a global conflict, a war. But what was the role of the Second World War in economic recovery? Was it the war that saved the economy, or did it only accelerate something that was already happening? The crisis of 1929 began in the United States, but it did not stay there, because at that moment, the world was already deeply connected, economically, financially, and commercially. After the First World War, the United States became the center of the global economy, the creditor of the world, the main financier of Europe, the main engine of international growth. Countries depended on American money, on loans, on investments, on credit, and this created a silent problem, a dependency. When the American economy grew, the world grew with it. But when it fell, the world fell with it. With the collapse in the United States, banks began to withdraw their investments from abroad. They stopped lending. They cut international credit. And this directly affected Europe. One of the most affected countries was Germany. After the First World War, Germany depended heavily on American loans to rebuild its economy, to pay debts, to maintain its stability. When that money stopped arriving, the German economy collapsed. European banks began to fail. Companies closed. Unemployment increased. Production fell. And the scenario that once seemed controlled turned into crisis. International trade was severely affected. Countries began to close their economies, raise tariffs, reduce imports, reduce exports. The flow of goods drastically decreased, and the world began to retreat. Less trade, less production, less jobs, less income. The cycle of the crisis repeated itself, now on a global scale. In Latin America, the impact was also strong. Many countries depended on the export of agricultural products, coffee, sugar, minerals. With the drop in global demand, prices collapsed, and these economies entered into crisis. It was no longer a problem of one country. It was a worldwide crisis. Banks failing, companies closing, unemployment rising, instability growing. And when the economy collapses, politics changes. Governments begin to be questioned. Systems are challenged. Ideologies gain strength. And that is exactly what happened. The crisis created a dangerous environment. Hopelessness, anger, uncertainty. And in moments like this, people look for solutions. Fast, strong, radical. And it was in this scenario that new movements began to emerge. New ideas, new leaders. Some promised stability, others promised power. And among these movements, some would change the world irreversibly. But how did the crisis help in the rise of authoritarian regimes? What was its role in the rise of leaders like Hitler? And how does this connect to the Second World War? The crisis of 1929 did not destroy only economies. It shook governments, destabilized societies, and changed the course of world politics. Because when the economy collapses, People stopped believing in the system. Millions were unemployed, without money, without prospects, and they began to question, did capitalism fail? Is democracy effective? Is there another alternative? In moments of crisis, radical ideas gain strength. Promises of rapid change, promises of order, promises of solutions. And that is exactly what happened. In Germany, the situation was even more severe. The country was already facing difficulties since the end of the First World War. Debts, inflation, political instability. And when the crisis of 1929 arrived, everything got worse. Millions of Germans became unemployed. The economy collapsed. Companies closed. Families went hungry. And the population completely lost confidence in the government. The Weimar Republic was already fragile, and the crisis was the final blow. Democracy began to weaken. The political system began to collapse. It was in this scenario that a name began to gain strength: Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. Hitler used the crisis as an argument. He promised jobs, stability, order, national greatness, and he pointed out culprits: the government, other countries, minorities. As the crisis worsened, support for Nazism grew, because for many, it was the only visible alternative, the only promise of change. And this did not happen only in Germany. Other countries also faced radicalization. Authoritarian regimes began to emerge. Stronger governments, less democratic, more centralized, because in times of stability, people defend freedom, but in times of crisis, many accept control, if that means security. The combination of economic crisis, political instability, and ideological radicalization created an explosive scenario. The world was changing and moving toward a new conflict. Throughout the 1930s, tensions increased. Countries armed themselves. Governments became more aggressive, and the international system began to break. The crisis of 1929 did not cause the war alone, but it created the perfect environment for it to happen. Without the crisis, history could have been different. And then, in 1939, the world entered war once again. But was it the war that truly ended the crisis? How did a global conflict manage to reactivate the economy? At the end of the 1930s, the world was facing something different. It was not only an economic crisis, it was a global crisis, political, military, ideological, and then the war began. In 1939, Germany invaded Poland, and the world entered war once again, a conflict on a global scale, with total mobilization of countries, of industries, of entire societies. And something changed completely. Economies began to reorganize, no longer for consumption, but for war. Factories that once produced consumer goods now produce weapons, tanks, aircraft, ships, ammunition. Industrial production skyrocketed to levels never seen before. Companies returned to operation. Factories were reactivated. New industries emerged. The system began to move again. And with that came something fundamental: jobs. Millions of people were hired: men, women, workers from all areas. Unemployment, which had once been massive, began to disappear. With millions of men going to front, women took on industrial roles. They worked in factories, in war production, in the economy. This transformed society. With employment came income. With income came consumption. And with consumption, the economy began to grow again. The government began to control the economy intensively. Planning, production, distribution, investment. It was a massive intervention, much greater than anything seen in the New Deal. And this raises an important question. Was it the war that ended the Great Depression? The answer is not simple. The New Deal stabilized the economy, created structure, and prepared the system. But it was the war that brought scale, speed, and total mobilization. The combination of massive public spending, large-scale production, full employment, reactivated the economy definitively. But there is a paradox. The crisis was overcome through one of the greatest conflicts in history. Millions of deaths, global destruction, and suffering. The economy began to grow again, but the cost was enormous. And this raises a profound reflection. To what extent do systems need extreme crises to reorganize? But the story does not end here, because the crisis of 1929 left deep marks and changed the world forever. What were the consequences of this crisis? How did it change capitalism? And why, even today, does it remain so important? The crisis of 1929 was not just an economic collapse. It was a turning point, a moment that changed the functioning of the modern world. After it, nothing returned to being the same. Before the crisis, the dominant ideal was clear. The market regulates itself. Little intervention, few rules, little control. But the crisis showed something different. Systems without control can collapse. And when they collapse, they affect millions of people. After 1929, the role of the government changed. The state began to be seen as a regulator, a protector, a stabilizer. Governments began to intervene more, create rules, supervise banks, control risks. Security mechanisms were created, deposit insurance, financial regulation, market control. To prevent something like this from happening again, the crisis also changed the relationship with work. Labor rights gained strength, minimum wage, regulated working hours, worker protection, because it became clear, without protection, society collapses. In many countries, a new model emerged, the so-called welfare state, a system in which the government assumes responsibility for the well-being of the population, health, employment, assistance, security. Capitalism did not end, but it changed. It adapted. It became more regulated, more controlled, more balanced, at least for a time. The crisis left a clear lesson. Growth without control can be dangerous. Speculation can destroy economies. Blind confidence can lead to collapse. For decades, the Great Depression served as a warning. Economists studied it, governments prepared, and policies were created to avoid a repetition. But the question remains, did we really learn from the crisis? Or are we doomed to repeat the same mistakes? Because even years later, other crises happened, other collapses emerged, and many times for the same reasons. And this raises an even bigger question. Was the crisis of 1929 unique? Or was it just the first great crisis of the modern world? The crisis of 1929 ended, but its effects never completely disappeared. It left marks, changed systems, and redefined the way the world works to this day. Many of the structures that exist today were born in that period. Bank regulation, control of the financial market, economic stimulus policies, state intervention in times of crisis. All of this is a direct result of the Great Depression. The crisis taught something fundamental. The economy is not made only of numbers. It is made of confidence. And when confidence breaks, the entire system can collapse. Decades later, other crises happened, the 2008 crisis, financial collapses, economic bubbles, and in many of them, the same patterns appeared: excess of credit, speculation, lack of control, excessive confidence. And when these factors combine, the result is familiar. And perhaps this is the greatest lesson. Systems seem stable until they are not. Before 1929, no one imagined the collapse. Before other crises, the feeling was the same. The modern world operates in balance between economic freedom and control, between growth and stability, between risk and security. And this balance is never permanent. The crisis of 1929 does not belong only to the past. It is part of the present. It influences decisions, policies, economies, governments, even today. And this leads us to an inevitable question. Did we really learn from history? Or are we just repeating patterns with new technologies and new names? Because history does not repeat itself exactly, but it rhymes, and the same structures can lead to the same results. The crisis of 1929 showed the world that systems can break, that economies can collapse, and that the future can change in a matter of days. But it also showed something more important: that societies can adapt, that systems can evolve, and that crises can redefine the world. The Great Depression was not just an economic crisis. It was the moment when the world realized how fragile it really was. If you made it this far, thank you for watching. If this video helped you better understand history, leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more content like this. See you next time.